Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Croeso, welcome to a session where we are in conversation with Professor Mick Waters. We being Rebecca Roach and myself, Mandy Esseen, both of whom lead on induction for NQTs in Central South Consortium. Now, Mick has worked in many roles in education over, I won't say how many years, but he has worked very closely with Welsh Government on aspects of policy change that genuinely affect the practice of teachers in classrooms. And that includes your practice as newly qualified teachers. So we're going to ask him some questions to just unpick some of his learning over time about education, particularly education in relation to the newly qualified teacher. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca for our first question.
So Mick, Mandy and I have been fortunate enough to hear you talk and present many times. And one of the things you like to say is that despite all the things that you've done, your most important job is being a teacher. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, it is, isn't it? The job of the teacher is the most important job in education. If we want children to do as well as they can in life, then the person who's next to them, trying to help them to learn, planning the opportunities they get, is going to have the most impact. And I always think that wherever you work in the education system, whether you're a head teacher or whether you're somebody who's responsible for a group of schools or a particular aspect of the way the school system works, the job is to make that teacher's job as effective as possible. So I always love the Gino quote that I've come to the frightening conclusion that I'm the decisive element in the classroom, and it's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. And as a teacher, I possess this tremendous power to make a child's life or miserable or joyous. And I think if we can support teachers to create the best weather in the classroom, then our children benefit enormously. So I've always thought teaching was the job. I'm a teacher who never grew up. Whatever I've done, I've always believed that the classroom is the place where the real work takes place and the real difference is made.
That's absolutely great. I love the idea of dictating the weather in the classroom. I wish we could dictate the weather outside today. It's really rainy.
Well, what all the other people do is they create the climate, you see. So they make it either stormy or fair weather, or they make it, where you hear the rumbles in the distance of the thunder coming, but it never really arrives. They're the people who set the scene in which the weather takes place. So teachers are enormously affected by the way in which the system works around them. But I think anybody in the system who supports NQTs or tries to help a school get better always has to have in mind that really what we're trying to do is make teaching as good as it can be.
That's great. Thank you. Now, most people will know that you played a central role in developing the new set of professional standards for teachers and leaders. They're not so new now. They've been embedded for a few years. How did that come about, though? And what were the guiding principles that you held on to as you led those development groups forward?
Oh, that was an interesting time. That was 2016 that I first got involved with the Welsh Government's policy to think again about the professional standards for teaching. And what had happened was that Professor Donaldson had written a report the year before, 2015, called Successful Futures. And in that, he had talked about the way in which schooling in Wales could move forward and develop. And the government accepted all of his recommendations. And he suggested that the curriculum needed to change. But if the curriculum was really going to change, then what we had to do was look carefully at how teachers worked. And if we look carefully at how teachers work, we had to look at how well they were trained. And then we had to look at how well they were inducted into the profession and so on. We had to look at the way leadership of schools work. So one of the things the Welsh Government did very, very early was say, let's look at the professional standards for teaching and leadership. And they invited me to work with people across the country to develop the new standards. So they're not my standards, they're standards that evolve from a group of people, big group of people, really thinking about what we needed to do. So previously there'd been 55 standards. And the government said, if we're really going to trust our teachers, as Graham Donaldson said we should, and put responsibility with our teachers and decision making with our teachers, what we've got to do is think about whether 55 standards is really trusting teachers. So we ended up with 5 standards, and I personally think the standards are really good. There was a lot of nervousness at the time because the reforms were very new. They were just sort of 1 year in, as it were, and the new curriculum hadn't been developed. That's only recently been sort of pushed through to statute. So people were grappling really in the dark with the new standards and where they should go. And even though Graham Donaldson had said we need to put trust in teachers, he used this lovely word, a subsidiarity, that decisions need to be made by the people nearest to where the decision makes a difference. So, and I had to look that word up. I didn't know what it meant. But if we were really going to trust teachers, we needed to do it differently. But people still live in the past. It's really hard to imagine the future when you live in the present that's built on the past. And people were still looking over the shoulder. And so we ended up with 32 descriptors that fit into the 5 standards for teaching, professional standards for teaching. And really, we need to think again about those. When they were first invented, as it were, we said that they need to be rethought after 3 years. Well, it's well gone 3 years now, but we thought that once 3 years had moved on and once the curriculum had been embedded and other reforms were in place, people would start to see it differently and want to describe the standards in a different way. So it's probably time to think again and work them through. But I think the notion of the 5 standards and the, if you like, the headings of the 5 standards are really strong, and they should carry any NQT through their career. If they focus on those 5 standards, they'll end up as really good teachers.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think those 5 standards are really clear. I was wondering if you could maybe help us to unpick a bit more how an NQT would really embrace those 5 standards in their practice.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're an NQT, the first thing to do is to care about children and care about children's growth and care about how you help them to learn and care about being a teacher in a team and making a difference for your school and care about the way Welsh education is going and what you can do for it. Now, in explaining it in the way I've just done, it almost sums up the standards. There are 5, and the first standard is that linked to pedagogy, which is fundamental. We want pedagogy, teaching, to be as strong as it can be. And who wouldn't want to? If you were a teacher, you would want to be the strongest teacher that you could be, wouldn't you? So it's sort of simple, but obvious, but really, really important. So how can I be the best teacher? And being the best teacher means learning more about it, professional learning, and that notion of endlessly reading and trying to learn from others and find out what's going on. And if you're professionally learning, then you need to work with others, collaborate with others, help others, support teams, try and get people in your school working together so that you're always contributing special gifts or talents you've got, or just putting your shoulder to the wheel. And then, of course, you'd want teachers who innovate. Goodness me, if teaching's the same in 10 years' time as it is now, there's something wrong with it, because we really want to see teaching becoming a modern outlook profession. And lastly, there's that notion of taking leadership. And I think sometimes NQTs would think, well, leadership isn't for me, is it? That's for people who've been doing it a long while. But actually, a really good teacher exercises leadership in lots and lots of circumstances. So a good NQT probably at times works with other members of staff to help move things on in their school, particularly teaching assistants or people who are there to support children with additional learning needs. So almost without realising, you take on leadership roles and take things forward. So if you think about those 5 standards, pedagogy, innovation, professional learning, collaboration and leadership, they are what good teachers do. And for an NQT, it's just really thinking about those all the time, not thinking, well, first I'll be a teacher, and then when I've done that, I'll do a bit of working with others and collaborate. And after that, I'll do a bit of, and eventually I'll get to leadership. No, you're doing all the time. That's why the professional standards are shown in a circle in the diagram at the beginning, that we sort of move out from that centre and get a bigger and bigger compass of things that we can do and enjoy doing and are good at. So I mean, the standards should be about helping us to be good and better and best. The old standards and the ones we had a job getting sort of passed were about proving that you were good enough. And I think if you've trained and you've been accepted as a teacher, we should accept you're good enough, and we should say, come on, and show us how good you are and how good you can be. This notion of proving isn't what the standards are about. The standards are about trying to grow and develop and be a full professional in every sense.
I completely agree with that, Mick. I think, the standards are the right ones, and they are about improving, not proving. They're not a tick list, they're not a checkbox. But even so, our newly qualified teachers do have to demonstrate that they're progressing, that they are making those improvements as teachers over time within the induction period. And one of the ways they do that is to demonstrate progress against, you mentioned, the 32 descriptors that sit underneath the 5 standards. Have you got any advice for them to sort of bear in mind as they do this? They've got to write these professional learning experiences. Any guiding advice?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that there are 32 descriptors that when we set about trying to reform the standards in 2016, there was one group of people who said, well, surely we don't need to do this. People can think about the way they're developing and they're supported by mentors and verifiers and so on. And do they really need to keep a record? But I remember I said that the system, in a sense, wanted to trust teachers, but didn't know if it dare. And so the argument in the end was won by the people who said we'll have to have a record that proves that people are good enough, because otherwise the public might think that our teachers aren't as good as they've always been. So I can understand that argument. The worry I always have is that the descriptors become hurdles that newly qualified teachers think they've got to jump. If you're and forgive me, I know a lot of newly qualified teachers aren't young. They're not 22 and 23. Some are mature people coming into the profession. But for a lot of people, the majority, they're sort of 22, 23. Ever since they were in primary school, they've been sort of taught, when somebody gives you these things, this is what to do, this test, this is what you've got to do to jump over the hurdle. And as long as you just clear the hurdle, that's okay. So we've, some of the NQTs we remember doing SATs and just about clear, oh goodness, they might have been good fun, but we as long as you tick all the boxes or put the lights on, you get the right level. And then you come to GCSEs and you do the same. And I bet, excuse me, some of the people listening to this will remember when they came out of, say, their history GCSE or their modern languages GCSE, where they came out and said, thank goodness for that. I never have to do history again or mathematics again or art again, but I passed the exam. I've just cleared the hurdle. And then they do A levels and they've just got to clear the hurdle. And then they go to university or maybe straight to a initial teacher education course. And again, you get this mentality that, well, I forgive all my sins if I can just clear the hurdle and prove that I'm good enough. So there's no wonder, is there, when you're presented with 32 descriptors, you think I've got to prove that I'm good enough, as opposed to use them in a really professional way. Now, my urging would be, don't get into the habit of thinking, well, there's 32 of those and there's 39 weeks in a normal school year. So if I do about one a week, I'll have them done.
Yes.
And don't go around looking for these things to, it's Sunday, I better fill in one of those forms. Don't see it as a clerical activity. If I were doing it, And I know it's easy for me to say, because you can see I've been around the block that many times that, you'd say, well, he's forgotten what an NQT year was like. But what I would do is say once every half term, the week before the half term, I would sit down and reflect on the 32 descriptors in the 5 standards and start to think where I'd made progress. Where have I been innovative over the last 4 or 5 or 6 weeks? When did I really collaborate with somebody and really make a difference in the way I contributed to a team? When did I do something where I really learned, where I read a book, or I went to a conference, or I talked to a member of staff that really opened my eyes to something? And when you made a list of that, you'll find places where they'll fit into the descriptors. And that's when I'd start writing. And it's easy to write when you've got something to write about. I think too often, and I sort of pity NQTs really, who sit there with the 32 standards and sit there thinking, what can I write in this space? Honestly, if you have a good experience, you'll have plenty to write about. You take children on a visit, they've got plenty to write about when they come back. It's when we give them nothing to think about that they struggle to write. So I would, every half term, just sit down and reflect on the half term, perhaps with a mentor who's a really good professional guide, and think about where you've grown, where you've developed, where your pedagogy's got better, make some notes, and then turn to the 32 descriptors and start to add on to onto the clerical bit, the things that are coming into your mind. And the writing will come easy. It's the people who see it as a burden that find it a burden. It really isn't. It's an opportunity to show what you've done and where you've grown and what you've achieved, and it's just lovely. So take it that way.
Yeah. I think that is such a helpful strategy for our NQTs, because I think what you're saying is that, it's important to look at them in a much more holistic way, and to reflect on your experiences first and then go, to the writing. So, yeah, that's really helpful. If we could focus in on the collaboration standards in particular, the NQTs have to work with an IM, they have to work with an EV, they'll be working with colleagues in their school, they'll be working with TAs in the classroom, they might have some contact with senior leadership team or school governors. So have you got any advice that you could give NQTs about building effective, positive, professional relationships with others?
Yeah, I think that's a really good one, because it is interesting that you've been in some form of initial teacher education, some sort of training. Sometimes it's school-based training, sometimes it's training that's taking place in higher education. And typically you've been a person who's on a course and been sort of supported by others. Often they're presenting to you or delivering to you, I don't like the phrase, but they're sort of leading your learning, and suddenly you're through that sort of cling film into the job, and then it's your job to sort of take it on from there. And you're surrounded by these people that all have different jobs, many of which are to support you, but you're not quite sure how they are supporting you. And it's easy to sort of become the passive person in the relationship rather than the person who's driving the agenda. And I just wish that when people left the training phase and they were qualified as a teacher, that they would hear the word qualified and think, I am qualified, I can do this, and go from there, so that they drive the agenda in that early part of the career and throughout the career. So if you're a teacher in the classroom, you should have a mentor who's going to help you within your school to develop as well as you can. So crucially, you want a good relationship with those, don't you? But it shouldn't just be a sort of, please tell me what to do relationship. It should be, look, I really like teaching these things and I'm less confident in these. Can you help me get really good in the things I feel confident in? And can you give me a few tips on how I can find out about the things I've always found a little bit challenging? And really good mentors will open doorways for you and find ways into opportunities to build your own strength and your own capacity as a teacher. And the person who's called the verifier, I mean, what a funny word. That I always think these words, where do they come from? I'm a verifier. Fancy getting up in the morning and saying, I'm a verifier. I'm a very this, I'm a very that, I'm a verifier. And you set off to verify something. I mean, can you imagine driving down the road to a school thinking, I'm going to verify somebody? Who would apply for that job? But anyway, oh dear me goodness. Their job really is to create a relation, the verifier, the job is to create a relationship with a mentor so that they validate what the mentor is doing in order to approve, if you like, the NQT at the end of the induction period. But really, the verifier is another one who's trying to sort of help the NQTs generally be as good as they can be. So they go to one school and they see an NQT having certain sorts of experiences, maybe working with different age groups of children just now and again, so they get that feeling of progression and development. And they might come to your school and say, hey, I've just been watching a school that's been helping an NQT to widen their experience in this way. So they're sort of advising you and the mentor how you can take your job on. So while it's called a verifier, I think actually the job is to really sort of bring understanding about the development of NQTs together to try and move it on. And then of course NQTs have those other people that they need to relate with. And it's a funny world, isn't it? Because the sort of hierarchy of teaching all around you as an NQT makes you think, flipping heck, you know, here I am as a little person in this great big agenda with people coming in from consortia and local authorities, and really it's so complicated. You think that actually I'm only a little person in all this. And what you've really got to think is I'm the most important person in all this because I teach the children. So your job is to support me to be as good as I can be. I do think NQTs need, and I think it should be in training as well, that NQTs need real support in how to best use people like teaching assistants and people who are there to help with children with additional learning needs, how to work with people from local authorities or consortia who come in to help specific groups of children and so on. And maybe over time in your first year, that's where you do have to sort of explore how the system works much more. I think one of the things that should be in the induction, in the initial training period, is a real clarity for people about how the schooling system works, so we understand who does what job. I think that's one of the failings in training, that people are taught to look into the classroom, at the detail of the classroom, but they are not given sufficient image of the big picture and how it all works. So I think using the mentor is absolutely crucial, but you've not got to be a passive person. You've got to be the person who's asking questions, opening doors. Can I watch you teaching? Can I come into your classroom? Can you show me how to do things? Really suck up every bit of energy you got. And I do know a lot of mentors in the Welsh schools, and you know, most people who are mentors are desperately keen to help somebody into the profession. When a mentor was an NQT themselves, most of them remember an experienced teacher who helped them, and most now want to pay it back and give the new qualified teachers the best experience they can have. So they're ever so open to being, you know, that person to support and help and advise and cajole and challenge and, you know, shoulder to cry on, shoulder to lean on, somebody to give me a push when I need it. That's the sort of person, that relationship will get you through and take you a long way.
It's such an empowering message, Mick, to an NQT, you know, to have agency in the relationships that they forge, and to, you know, to kind of be restlessly seeking professional dialogue and reflection, and to know that there are different people around them, all of whom have something to offer. It's a great message of equity as well in that that professional relationship within a school context. Yeah, and of course you've already spoken comprehensively about the standards and your thoughts behind the standards, but you really do know induction inside out, don't you? Because in the last couple of years you've conducted a really thorough review of the induction process in Wales. And I think that review took you north, south, east and west and central. And as a result of that review and speaking to lots of induction stakeholders, you submitted a report, intriguingly entitled, first part, Learning to be a Teacher for Wales. I was always really struck by that. And I always wanted to ask you why you chose the title, Learning to be a Teacher for Wales, and what are the implications of that for NQTs?
Oh, it was a lovely thing to do. I mean, I've always believed in NQTs. When I was a head teacher, I used to go out my way to appoint head NQTs, partly because you could mould them to think as you think and get them to do things in your schools that perhaps other people were less sure about, but partly because there's something wonderful about sort of setting people on the trail of professional inquiry, professional zeal, really, that they want to be the best teacher they can. And you know, I'm at the twilight of my career where I look back and see people who are NQTs in my schools as head teachers now across England mainly, but they're people who in their school carry real philosophy for learning, and I look at them as head teachers trying to help NQTs now and thinking, do you know, there's something special about being a teacher. I was about me being a teacher, trying to help children through the way you help teachers. So when I got asked to do that report for the Welsh Government on how the induction period might be considered, well, I was delighted to do it, and I just had such a good time talking to NQTs and people who support them and people who help them in all sorts of ways. And I chose the title because I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn to be teachers. I mean, you know, I just said I'm in the twilight of my career, but I'm still trying to learn. I still want to be better than I am. And before COVID, I used to spend a lot of time in classrooms teaching children, not as much as the teachers listening to this, you know, a couple of half days a week, but really working with children to try and understand how learning evolves, because we haven't cracked it as a system yet. We if only we could, you know, deliver a system that made every child read the minute we started teaching, wouldn't life be easy? But however much better we are at teaching reading, we've never cracked it. So I think we're all trying to learn to be teachers. And if we're in Wales, we're trying to be a teacher for Wales. I don't think it's about being a teacher just for the children in our classroom or just for the children in our school. I think the really good teachers, if you're teaching in Cardiff, you're thinking, how can I help a teacher in Bangor? And how can I learn from a teacher in Flint? And how can I use what teachers in Caerphilly are developing alongside what they're developing in Merthyr Tydfil to really bring forward some ideas that will influence teachers in Haverfordwest? And I want to be part of a big community. To be honest, I think it goes further than that. I think one of the things NQTs should really experience is some sort of linkage with teachers across the world. I think, you know, the use of technology in pandemic has shown us how you can link teachers together so easily. And if we just really understood, you know, there's a big Welsh community in Patagonia. Wouldn't it be lovely if teachers were NQTs were linking up with those and going there? So the title was chosen. I just think that's what we're doing, learning to be a teacher for Wales and taking it from there. I mean, it was fascinating for me. Some of the things that came out of that were a question about the extent to which newly qualified teachers often feel passive in the system. And they're supported by all those people we mentioned before, and the danger of support being a sort of wraparound care to the extent that you don't have to think for yourself and you don't have to stand on your own feet, I think is really challenging for us. So for anybody who's watching this who supports NQTs, there's a delicate balance between supporting them and mollycoddling. So that if you really sort of coddle somebody, in the end they become weaker. What we've got to do is get people to be stronger by giving responsibility, giving opportunity, by taking them deeper, by challenging in the nicest professional way. And one of the things I talked about in that report was how a lot of NQTs didn't understand the system, so they always felt they're on the coattails of it, hanging on to it as the little NQT at the end of the chain, rather than the most important person with the children in the classroom making the difference, supported by this great big pyramid underneath. And that sort of notion of being a really big, important professional has to come across in a really powerful way. And I hope that some of the recommendations in the report will come to fruit in the end. I mean, if there's an NQT watching this and doesn't know what I'm talking about in terms of this report, have a look at it, because it is a government report, but only the bit at the end is the sort of formal bit. There's quite a lot of it which I think is relatively pleasant reading and quite nice to read in a sense, and it tells the story of NQT life. And if you're a mentor who's watching this, I'd really recommend you reading it. However much gets taken on by statute or not, I think there's a lot of messages in that for people who are trying to support, and I know people try incredibly hard to support NQTs.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I was, really inspired and encouraged when I read the report. Lots of the messages in there. My final question is about how NQTs can become the leaders of tomorrow. And you've already mentioned things like agency, but, in the widest sense of the word leaders, because, some of our NQTs may be thinking, I don't want to become a head of department or an assistant head teacher, but in the widest sense of that word leader, what would you say to our NQTs about becoming the leaders of tomorrow?
Well, it's a lovely question, because leadership isn't all about title. Leadership, you can be a leader who's a head of department or a head of phase or a head of a school or one of the jobs outside the school system. But leadership is an act. It's a way of being that I take responsibility and I support other people when they need help. And sometimes I suggest to the group of people that I'm working with that I know the way forward, and I'm prepared to work it through for us so that we can all find our way through this problem or take this opportunity and move forward. So I think there's something about what the word leadership means. I mean, we did talk when we were developing the standards about whether we should call it leadership or whether we should call it responsibility, taking responsibility. But in the end, the people developing the standards thought leadership was a more appropriate term. And I think fundamental to leadership is that optimism prevails, that you believe that you're going to make a difference and you're going to make progress in what is a challenging job. Teaching's not an easy job. Teaching's not a simple job. Teaching's the most complicated, the most challenging job in terms of trying to make it work. But we don't have to add to the challenges by creating a clerical world around the side that makes it sort of complicated and hard work. What we do is it's an intellectual challenge to be a teacher. How do we solve the problem of that child that can't read? How do we help that child to make relationships with other people when it seems to struggle at the moment? How do we help that little girl really explore location in geography? How do we help that little lad over there to understand that punctuation is quite important if you're trying to get people to read what you're writing? How do you help that nervous 14-year-old to come to terms with speaking in another language when actually they're quite shy in their own language in the first place? They're the intellectual challenges that we all grapple with as teachers to try and make learning become accessible for every child and make it matter. And so when you talk about becoming a leader in the profession, I think it is about being a confident person who knows about teaching and is assertive about how to be it. So 15 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, you might be a teacher who's still absolutely enjoying the classroom and doesn't want to take on one of those leadership roles that some people see as very important and they want to do. But what you are is somebody who's confident in your professional ability, confident in yourself as a professional, that you're well read, you're learned, you're part of a community and going forward in a really strong way. When I was doing that report on the induction period, I asked lots of NQTs to what extent they would take themselves off to conferences. You know, when you see a conference advertised about something in Cardiff or maybe on the web, would they enroll and go, or would they ask their school if they could have some time to go to the conference? And nearly every one of them said, "Oh no, no, they're not for NQTs. They're for people further on in the profession." Now, I fundamentally believe that they are for NQTs, and NQTs should go to them. So while I was doing that report, having had this conversation with some NQTs, I invited them to some conferences that I was going to. Sometimes I was speaking at. Sometimes in the evening, 7 o'clock in the evening. And I remember, is it the Tram Shed or Tramway or something like that?
Cardiff.
Down in Cardiff. There was a conference there one evening that was being organised by one of the universities. And I took 4 NQTs along to the conference. And when we got there, they were introduced to the minister, and they were introduced to senior civil servants, and they were introduced to people from Esseen, and they were introduced to people from universities, and they were welcomed because the people were there as professionals and just saw them as professionals. Now, I think it shouldn't be for somebody to drag 4 along. I think if you're a head teacher watching this, you should be thinking, where can I take the NQT so that they get immersed into this profession and feel part of it? If you're the mentor, I would be asking, how can you get your NQT immersed into the profession and feel part of it? And I think leadership that NQTs experience can be explored, but it also can be offered. And if you're an NQT and somebody offers you the chance to read a book or join a meeting or go to a conference or go to visit another school, grasp that opportunity, because it's the first step on really exerting leadership on your own career. I don't think it's leadership of others all the time. It's leadership of your own career and leadership of your own development so that you can become the very best person in teaching that you can be.
Mick, this has been a delightful, thought-provoking conversation. And Rebecca and I just know that for our newly qualified teachers and those people who support them, it will be absolutely inspiring to listen to. Thank you so much for today.
Oh, Mandy and Rebecca, it's been lovely to talk with you, and I hope it is useful. I mean, to any NQT watching this, or to any mentor, anybody watching this really, I think it's just really important to think that in 20, 30 years' time, children we're teaching in our classroom today will bring back in an instant a memory of their school career, their time with you, our time with us. And we'd want them to bring back really lovely memories, wouldn't we? We want them to bring back, positive things. And that means we've got to keep doing positive things in the classroom and in the jobs we do. So thanks for listening to me. And if you're an NQT, keep doing good things and have a really good career.
Diolch am wrando ar y benod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.